We are so grateful to be welcoming Dr. Gilda Barabino, president of AAAS and Olin College, and a professor of biomedical and chemical engineering, whose research is in health and health equity, and who is an elected member of the National Academies of Engineering and Medicine, as well as the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and is a AAAS fellow. And Dr. Jessica Ware, the immediate past president of the Entomological Society of America and Worldwide Dragonfly Association boards, an associate curator of invertebrate zoology at the American Museum of Natural History, and a co-founder of Entomologists of Color. And we're also delighted to have our panel moderator, Stacie East, the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Entomological Society of America, and a veteran defense attorney, senior DEI official, and adjunct faculty member who is a highly valued member of our Consortium Leadership Council and whose contributions to this convening and the ongoing work of the consortium are far too many to chronicle here. An edited version recording of this panel that you're about to hear, together with pre-recorded excerpts from interviews of Dr. Sudip Parikh, the CEO of AAAS and executive editor of the Science family of journals, and Dr. David Skorton, president and CEO of the Association of American Medical Colleges, together representing leaders with a breadth of experience and identities, will create a library of 5 to 10-minute videos on important topics of transformative and courageous leadership that will be released after the convening and will undoubtedly be high value to our members, CEOs, board leadership, and all those in societies who are working to create more ethical, inclusive, and equitable STEM fields. Drs. Barabino and Ware on our live panel will make presentations first, followed by a pair of two short excerpts from Drs. Parikh and Skorton. And then the second half of our panel will be dedicated to the live panel's discussion with the moderator and audience Q&A. I'll now turn this program over to our moderator, Stacie East.
Thank you, Jamie, for allowing me this opportunity to engage in this great conversation. I'd just like to note that Jessica is still the Entomological Society of America's president through our annual meeting, our joint annual meeting in November. But Dr. Barabino, welcome. It's a pleasure to meet you. Your career has been impressive and has afforded you the opportunity to participate in and lead many efforts with which impact the ability of women and historically excluded communities to participate in the academy and STEM professions. Can you please share some of your perspectives?
Sure. Thank you so much, Stacie. I'd be delighted. I really appreciate this opportunity to share my perspectives in this important convening on sexual harassment in STEM and medicine. My comments are shaped by my experience as president of AAAS and president of Olin College, and by my lived experience as a Black woman in the academy. I have participated in and led many efforts to promote and advance women and members of historically excluded communities. And one of those efforts was being a member of the Consensus Study Committee that produced the 2018 National Academy's Sexual Harassment Report. So let me draw your attention to the recommendation in the report that specifically targeted professional societies. Quoting the recommendation, which I'm sure you've all read and know, professional societies should accelerate their efforts to be viewed as organizations that are helping to create culture changes that reduce or prevent the occurrence of sexual harassment. They should provide support and guidance for members who have been targets of sexual harassment. They should use their influence to address sexual harassment in the scientific, medical, and engineering communities they represent, and promote a professional culture of civility and respect. And notably, among the findings of the study was that harassment persists when it is tolerated, meaning that it persists when there are no or few consequences or little accountability for the behaviors. So what's essential in creating a culture that prevents sexual harassment and more broadly creates a culture that welcomes and supports all members of the community, is the centering of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as ethics. As president of AAAS, I have the privilege of leading an organization that does just that. And I'm going to share some strategies from my perspective that demonstrate leadership by AAAS in addressing sexual harassment in particular, and in creating a culture of inclusion, civility, and respect. AAAS made a commitment to support culture change that would make harassing behaviors clearly unacceptable. This includes policies that make clear expectations of non-harassing behavior in its activities and in its meetings, and to hold persons accountable for these behaviors as a breach of professional norms. AAAS put in place policies to ensure that activities and meetings were safe spaces, that expectations of behavior were articulated, forbidding harassment. AAAS has vetting for its awards and requirement of attestation from nominators for fellow, that individuals being advanced for such recognition have not been cited for harassing behaviors. AAAS Council approved a new policy that established sexual and gender-based harassment as a breach of professional ethics that could lead to revocation of AAAS fellow status. AAAS held town halls at its annual meetings to help provide more visibility to sexual and gender harassment in STEM and medicine and its impact on education and career advancement. AAAS took on the collaborative leadership role in the establishment of this society's consortium on sexual harassment in STEM and medicine. As you know, along with the American Geophysical Union, the Association of American Medical Colleges, and Education Council. And significantly, AAAS's signature institutional transformation program in support of diversity, equity, and inclusion, See Change, which is short for See Change with STEM and Medicine Equity Achievement. It includes attention to harassment and the ways in which colleges and universities respond to the issue. So currently, and looking to the future, AAAS and its leadership have embraced within its strategic vision the need to address and center diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM and medicine in support of excellence in research and innovation, as well as the need to provide opportunities for scientific engagement of all people at all stages of career pathways. We have taken a strong and unapologetic approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion that includes publicly available annual reporting of metrics and progress, a proactive stance against systemic racism and sexual and gender harassment and other intersecting forms of harassment, a platform to give voice to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, a governance modernization plan that integrates diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a mission to advance science, engineering, and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all people that is inherently viewed through the lenses of diversity, equity, inclusion, and ethics. In my own case, as a Black woman, often in solo status throughout my career, I turned to professional societies as a graduate student to broaden my experience. From committee service and other forms of engagement, I went on to hold progressively responsible leadership positions in a number of professional societies. I view professional societies as vehicles that by their nature are more agile than institutions and agencies in their ability to advance a given discipline and profession through recognition, dissemination, networking, leadership, and development. And importantly, as vehicles to advance people like me who have been historically excluded and racially marginalized. I joined AAAS shortly after obtaining my PhD, and I can attest to the effectiveness of their approach to supporting women and members of historically excluded communities. I'll note a few examples. AAAS provides opportunities for undergraduate and graduate students and early career individuals to be introduced to and have voice in the society. There's an early career board member, for example. And there's also a very strong and thriving Science and Technology Policy Fellows Program. And AAAS strongly fosters collaboration across sectors and disciplines. Throughout its 174-year history, AAAS has provided a platform for change for scientists and engineers throughout the world. It has taken courageous stances on equality in science, and it works tirelessly to create opportunities for and ensure that all are welcome and supported. This is what we need from our organizations. This is what we need from our leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barabino, for your comments and for your leadership in this area. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Jessica Ware. Dr. Ware, you are a leader who has championed diversity, inclusion, and equity for women, scientists of color, and LGBTQIA+ community members. What are some of the insights you've gleaned in your career?
Thank you for the question, Stacie, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you all here at this convening. So in my role as president of Entomological Society of America, I certainly have learned that DEI is really woven into the fabric of what we do as a society, as a learned or a scientific society, but it wasn't always this way. So it's really only just a little over the last 10 years that it's been this way. And the reason why we have this is because of steady, persistent work. And so my first insight really is just that this is something that you can't really take your foot off of the brake on. You know, you really need to be working steady and consistently to continue your work on DEI as a scientific society. We've made some pretty big changes in the Entomological Society of America that have really benefited members in the long run, but it only kind of is maintained by this steady and continuous work. We do this because on the one hand, we know that, you know, diverse teams are creative and they tend to solve problems faster. When directors or board members have been sometimes reluctant to go along with changes that we wanted to make that were related to DEI, we do always kind of try and remind us that this actually benefits science. When people say, what about the science? Why can't we just focus on the science? This actually does help us focus on the science, and it helps us kind of advance the science. But it's also for this other goal, right? Entomology problems are largely tied to the survival of humanity. So when we think about the loss of insects, when we think about food security, when we think about vector-borne illness, this all ties into humanity. And so there's really no reason why some subsets of humanity, some populations of humanity wouldn't be able to participate fully in solving problems that directly relate to the human condition, that directly relate to the chances of survival. So from a kind of a loftier goal, I guess, as a scientific society, we really want to make sure that we include everybody. Much like what was just discussed for the AAAS, we instituted a code of conduct as well as a code of ethics. And both of these kind of set clear expectations to our members about what the tolerated behavior would be, both at a meeting and kind of more broadly when people are back at their home institutions. And this is something that I think has really definitely benefited members, but it wasn't universally accepted. So my second insight is that even when things seem to be kind of inherently good, how could anyone object to this? This is going to be a slam dunk. There still can be reluctance. We are a large society with 8,000 members, and not all of the members are, as Jamie mentioned earlier, on the same kind of point on the path of going along a path of learning about DEI and building their skill set. As a Black queer woman, I definitely have noticed that we can't say that just because someone is very interested in DEI, it necessarily means that they're interested in supporting the identities of all of the members of humanity, right? So just because someone is very strong or has very strong skills in activism for promoting LGBTQAI+ causes, doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be well versed in kind of doing work to stop anti-Black racism, for example. So there's a lot. These things, these topics are really multifaceted, and so we really need to kind of, when we make these decisions, know that people are in different stages kind of along their journeys. And also, just because someone has an expertise that might be DEI related in one aspect, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have broad skills kind of writ large for other aspects of DEI work. One of the things that I noticed when we were trying to do some of the trickier decisions that we made as a board, these are things more about the language that we use, the choice of terms that we use, the way that we create an inclusive culture, the names that we use, for example, for our annual trivia game, which is one that entomologists loves to play at our annual meeting, or the names that we use for our common names, like the Better Common Name project that we launched last year. These are decisions to kind of tackle the language that we use and to make clear to our members that we do not use, or we do not intend to use pejorative slurs or slander particular groups of people or geographic areas. Those were decisions that kind of leadership had to make. Some decisions we involved a lot of member input and discussion, and I think it was really valuable to really make sure that everybody feels like they can be heard. And there is some element, I suppose, of peer pressure in a way when people realize that their voice of dissent, perhaps, was a minority voice, and maybe there were other people in their social circle, in their departments, who really felt strongly that removing pejorative names was going to benefit society. That kind of brought a lot of people along, I think, faster than they would otherwise have gone on their journey, on their DEI journey. So I would say that in general, for entomology and for the Entomological Society of America, the work that we've done, much like what was cited for the AAAS, has really been kind of foundational to set clear expectations and create an inclusive atmosphere, both at our meetings and kind of throughout the year. And we're starting to see returns. So we're starting to see that the numbers of members of racialized minorities, racialized minoritized groups are increasing. And we actually have numbers that are close to what you would expect based on human demographics for members in our society that identify as being in the LGBTQAI+ community. Why is that? That's actually very high compared to some other societies. And I think it's because of this steady, persistent work. So to go back to my first insight is none of these tasks can be done. I think Jamie used the phrase kind of one and done. They can't be one and done. They require constant, steady work to maintain kind of the high standards that you would expect for all of the members, kind of reminding them of what our shared values are and being willing to adjust those as times change. Certainly, we were able to kind of move the needle slightly faster in one direction or the other after pivotal kind of societal situations like the COVID pandemic and the murder of George Floyd. That allowed us to kind of make some decisions in a faster way than we may otherwise have been able to, because society was actively talking about it, and it allowed members a chance to really actively talk about it. The works that we've done has allowed us to be recognized. We won an award as our society for the Better Common Names project, which I think we're all very, very proud of. But it's really more than just the award. The award that we feel is probably not having our Roma colleagues have to hear pejorative slurs when describing an insect outbreak that's taking place in Eastern North America or what have you. So the work that we're doing, we see positive benefits. That's kind of a positive feedback that does help bring along members that might otherwise be reluctant to get on the train. So that's where I'll leave it there. Thanks, Stacie.
Thank you, Dr. Ware. I'm very happy to be a part of ESA and ESA's DEI effort. Drs. Ware and Barabino for being flexible in light of our technological challenges. Dr. Barabino, what does courageous and ethical action by a leader of a society governing board mean to you when the aim is gender and racial equity, diversity, and inclusion in a society and its fields? And can you share an example of when you personally took courageous action in engaging your board colleagues and senior administration or members of your society to advance these interests?
That's a broad question that could be answered many ways. And I was thinking about maybe one way to address it is that when you think about when you're tackling a really tough subject like diversity, equity, inclusion, and opinions will be all over the place, and people are at different stages of the spectrum of their understanding and their willingness to really do something significant in that space, people often go to backlash, like for fear of backlash or for fear of overinterpretation of a law or policy that kind of puts them in a place where they don't do anything. And so I think the leaders have to be courageous and ethical to say, no, that's not an excuse. You want to be understanding of potential backlash, but you don't use that as a reason not to move. You don't use that as a reason to stay inactive. So this idea of having the courage to speak up and not be tenuous. So it can't be like, oh, maybe, I think I feel okay about this. No, you have to be strong in your statement. So not being tenuous, not being afraid of backlash. And it's hard to give good examples without, dealing with things that sometimes that might be confidential. But I'm going to give an example that I think many people do recognize. And that's something like revocation of fellow status. So that's a tough one. And I have been involved in those kinds of situations. And I think it's important for the leadership to, when it's the right thing, to do it, to not like back off on, oh, I'm afraid, or someone might not like this. That I think is a concrete example of this concept of not being too afraid of backlash, doing what is the right and ethical thing to do, and being willing to stand up and have that voice that's not tenuous, that's very strong and adamant about what is just and fair.
Thank you, Dr. Barabino. Often when the question of backlash comes up, I think who's being centered in the fear of backlash, because there might always be a backlash.
Exactly.
Who's you're most concerned about. So, Dr. Ware, does the fiduciary duty of a society's governing board include advancing gender and racial equity and diversion and inclusion in a society and its fields? And if so, what does that look like?
It's a good question. And I would argue yes, because I think the fiduciary responsibilities we have are really to best serve members, all members, and to really enrich their experience as scientists. And so doing work to advance gender, racial equity, and diversity and inclusion, that's part of it. And I think it's so interesting because when I've served on small society boards and larger society boards, and it's always the same. People take the financial responsibility very seriously. When they get their board book, they have their calculator, they got a cup of coffee, and they're punching it in and making sure that there isn't a penny that was over or incorrect. They read through the minutes to make sure that there isn't a comma missing. But then when it comes to DEI report, they're just like, oh, you're doing that good work. And there's no comment. And I think that's maybe where we need to take out our version in this metaphor, I guess I'll say a calculator, which is that we should all be, as board members, responsible board members, just as we take seriously our editorial skills and grammatical skills and our math skills, we should be boning up on, really trying to learn a bit more about what the best practices are for DEI. And we should be kind of challenging and evaluating the work that our society is doing on DEI for all of the aspects, for all of the committees that we're working on. I think far too often, this isn't considered to be one of the main responsibilities of boards. Boards know in general that they should be doing it, but each individual board member may not take it as a personal responsibility. And so in not doing so, I think we miss that kind of critical eye. I think with more people, if they took as seriously the work to advance gender, racial equity, what have you, as they do, if they took it as seriously as they do trying to balance the budget or what have you in these board books, I think we would, all boards would really benefit from it.
Thank you. And so again, Dr. Ware, would you consider, or would you share key levers and strategies that you have used to successfully engage board colleagues to evolve their perspectives and willingness to take meaningful action regarding gender and racial equity, diversity and inclusion for ethics and excellence in the society?
That's a tough one. I could say, again, we've had some highs and lows. I mean, like all societies, there are some things that we've tried that haven't worked and some things that have worked. And I don't know if that necessarily means it's a hard and fast rule for success. But I will say that, as you know, Dr. Barabino mentioned, as Jamie mentioned, as many people have already mentioned, not everybody is starting from the same spot. So I think that kind of top-down instructions that this is what we're doing for DEI doesn't seem to go over very well. And I think people feel a lot more engaged in the work, engaged in the process when they feel like some of it can be their own ideas, and that they can go at their own pace. If it's a glacial pace, that's not going to work, right? If someone's going to need 10 years to get on board to have a code of ethics, that wouldn't work. But really allowing people to participate, doing conversations in small groups, I think can be very helpful. And also kind of just reminding us when we're all together as a group, as a board, for a society, what the shared kind of expectations are. Bring even the most reluctant members, I think, they can start to wonder, why is it that I'm only one person that's voting against this and everybody else is voting for this? There must be some extra information I need to have. And that's where some of these kind of small conversations can be really helpful, I think, to bring people along. I don't know that you can really have a good and effective group dynamic if you have people who you feel like you're dragging along, right? So if there's people who are very reluctant and you're dragging them along, that's going to slow down the entire board's progress, but you're also going to probably create a lot of resentment among those two, one or whomever it is that you're kind of dragging along. So I think that boards are, that's maybe one of the benefits of boards having turnover, is that that you do kind of constantly have new ideas coming in. And as the dynamic, as the community changes, the dynamic can sometimes change. But I think it's really important for leaders, for presidents or people who are in leadership roles on scientific societies, to really make time for conversation and to make time to hear a variety of voices, knowing that you don't necessarily have to have the a minority voice, like a minority opinion, maybe one lone person saying, I don't want to do DEI work. They don't necessarily have to be the one that's shaping or deciding what the entire board's going to do, but allowing them the opportunity to discuss their feelings and then hear from their peers why their peers might be feeling differently, why their peers might be voting, why the majority of the board might be voting in favor of best practices for supporting trans scientists or whatever the case might be that you're tackling. So I think that's something to really consider, is I think shutting down conversation or stifling conversation when you do have one or two people that might disagree with the group doesn't seem to work very well. It just seems to build resentment. So I would say listening is very important in making sure that people feel like they're heard, and then allow the democratic process to continue and still vote as you would normally, knowing that those one or two voices may not have the votes to necessarily decide the fate of a decision related to DEI.
Thank you, Dr. Ware. And Dr. Barabino, I have one last big question for you. If you could accomplish one priority related to gender and racial equity, diversity, and inclusion within your society or field, what would it be, and what would you need to see it through?
The whole world is equal, but but I'll give you something a little bit more down to earth. I think it's really important to give voice and visibility to women and those from historically excluded groups who have not had that voice and visibility, have not had that voice, visibility, and recognition, both for how to get there, and then when you're there, to be seen and heard in such ways that you can actually thrive. I know that, and I think it's been shown in the literature, that those who have been excluded, women and those from underrepresented groups, those who have been marginalized often are drawn to scientific fields because they want to give back. They want to help people. They want to make a difference in society. And the efforts to make that visible, make them visible and their contributions visible in ways that they can thrive is lacking. So I think that's really an important thing, that if I had one priority, I'd put that there. And how would you sustain it? One of the things that I think we don't do enough of is sharing our stories. I've been following the work lately of Marshall Gantz, which looks at storytelling as a mechanism for change. And there's so much about the human condition that we connect through stories. We understand each other's world through stories. And if we could get those who are not seen and whose stories are not being told in the mix, if we could connect that way in ways that could be a driver for change, those collective stories as a driver for change, to change our discipline, to change our profession, to change the face, to change the way we interact, to change what we do and how we do it, who gets to ask the questions, who gets to answer the questions, what looks like science. That would be my big goal.
I
Dr.
love that goal. I just wanted to say, I love that goal. That seems like a good goal.
Thank you, Dr. Ware.
And Dr. Barabino, I appreciate Dr. Gantz's work as it relates to social movements also, and I think that societies would benefit from becoming familiar with his work.
Absolutely.
And on that note, I believe that we can play the videos of Drs. Parikh and Skorton now.
One of the shortcuts I think that sometimes we fall prey to is we see a problem and we create a department and we hire someone to be accountable for that, and then I don't have to think about it anymore. And if we're going to actually make progress, if we're going to move needles, if we're going to have DE&I incorporated into everything we do, then it has to come from the tops of these organizations, the elected leadership and the executive leadership. And what that means is it's harder. It's harder. It means that taking on board this professional development, being a part of it yourself as a leader, and then living it. So that means that, you know, one of my proudest moments was when, as we were thinking through coming back into the office, hearing some of my mid-level managers asking the question, wait a second, how do we think about centering those who are going to have the most challenges with returning to the office? And what is that effect going to be upon them? And you know, you don't think that's a big deal, but it turns out that that's a really hard thing for people to learn, is to put themselves into the position of those we want to center most, and then to make sure that we have people around the table who understand, who are part of that community. And being able to talk about these things. So having seen that within the organization, I'm really proud of that. We have a long way to go. It is not, you're never done with these things, but seeing those types of conversations takes it to a different level, as opposed to the conversation of, well, that's off to the side and we'll check mark that for the board at the quarterly review that we did these things. It's not a part of it. It's actually a part of the culture. One of the
we developed, and when I say we, I mean the board and the leadership of the AAMC. We developed a new strategic plan beginning a few months after I came to the organization. And we decided to do it together, to do the conception and the writing and the argument and eventually the approval together as one combined body, the board and what we call the leadership team. And what we decided to do in that case was first to look at the mission and vision of the organization. We switched two words, doesn't sound like much, but our earlier mission statement was that we would serve and lead academic medicine. We switched serve and lead, so now it says we lead and serve, understanding that someone has to take the first step toward facing these issues, recognizing that we have failed to deal with them adequately, and then moving ahead together. I ask that our board, when they do my annual evaluation, in part, base it on the diversity, the composition of the organization, and the climate, the environment. whether it is an environment that is conducive to people feeling safe, to people feeling the possibility of success. And I passed that accountability down to the 15 people who report to me. We developed.
When I talk about scientific excellence, when I talk about two of the things that I think are some of the most exciting advances of the last couple of years, I think about the helicopter on Mars, and I look at that engineering team, and if you want to see that diverse teams have great achievements, look at that team. If you want to see another team that's an incredible scientific achievement, look at the mRNA vaccine coming from Moderna. There you would see a team that is made up of white Americans, Black Americans, men, women, immigrants, people who work in business and industry and in academia. And it took all of those people and the diversity of thought and the diversity of experience to get that product to market so quickly. And I can go on and on. These examples are not exceptions, they are the rule. They are the rule. These teams that have diversity of thought and experience are the ones that create the most innovation. And we have to tell those stories, and that's part of what we do as societies.
The fact that in 2022, we still have so much work to be done really should not depress us. It shouldn't shut us down emotionally or in terms of the work that we need to do. It should spur us on to say, thanks to things like the consortium, we can actually make progress. If we lean on each other, if we listen to those who are actually experiencing the issues that we're talking about, and if we're willing to try things, and if they don't work, to change them and try them again, and if they don't work, to change them and try them again, all the while collecting information and letting people know what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what the outcome is. My colleagues, my heroes who work in the world of diversity, get something called diversity fatigue, in which it's very, very hard to work on these issues over a long period of time and see some progress, 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. We're lucky if it's that, and it's not 2 steps forward, 3 steps backwards. And there are social, political, judicial issues that sometimes make it easier, sometimes make it harder. And so I want to take a moment to recognize and trumpet the experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion, including especially a focus on gender equity as well as racial equity around the country at every kind of institution, and to say how important I think those people are.
We appreciate Drs. Parikh and Skorton for taking the time to record videos, which we just viewed excerpts of. I'd invite the audience to put questions in the chat. But in the interim, I have one short question for you, Dr. Ware, and it follows a question that Dr. Barabino answered. And I realize this might be catching you off the cuff, but what is one book or resource or theorist that you think association professionals should be familiar with as they move forward in DEI issues?
Oh, that is a good one. Well, I guess I would say that one big blind spot for, I think, a lot of societies really is around, for DEI committees and in scientific societies, is really around trans health and wellness. And so I would really, I guess there's a variety of authors, I think, that out there whose scholarship is quite good. One of whom is my brother, who has written a lot on trans and disability studies in learned societies and scientific societies and academic societies, Cyrus Ware. But there's quite a few scholars that are out there working. Aidan Scheim is one, Zach Marshall, and what they write about is, I guess, the ways that people can try and encompass all of the variety that there is within humanity, but really centering, the very troublesome past of transphobia that is so pervasive, in particular in science. where trans bodies and trans spaces were kind of invaded for our scientific curiosity. And so I think that the lack of understanding, I think, about trans health and wellness really makes conversations in DEI inherent. Like we say, we're talking about all sorts of DEI. That's what I was kind of referring to before. But we're not, right? We really heavily focus on specific conversations about gender and specific conversations about race, but talking about Black trans health and wellness, we almost never discuss. So I would look to the work to Zach Marshall. I would look to Aidan Scheim. Also, I'll give a plug for Cyrus Ware, who is my twin, who is also trans. And because I think that that is one piece that I think is missing in most of our toolkits. It's rare that we get almost no education on this topic. We get some education about racial kind of literacy. We might learn a little bit about gender and sexual kind of harassment in our institutions, but I think that our understanding of trans health and wellness and how science has really created a extreme mistrust in certain communities. I think that's something that we could all really benefit from reading more about.
And for both Dr. Barabino and Ware, we're all familiar with the phrase, no money, no mission. So what do you think about when trying to finance or make sure that DEI initiatives are included in the budget or there's a way to support them financially?
I think we make choices, and for whatever resources we have, we should always be able to carve out some resources for diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's the choices that we make. And so it's how we allocate those resources. And the other thing I think about in terms of resources, about all the things that you could do for free. Like, it doesn't cost you money to be nice to another individual, to be civil. It doesn't cost you money to create an environment that says, I'm going to welcome someone and I'll actually have a scientific discussion with you as opposed to ignoring you, even though you have the same credentials, to show someone that they have the right to be there just as much as you do. So I think something about paying attention to the things that do not cost us money, because oftentimes people act like I can't do this because I need some money. Well, actually, that's not always the case. And I would like to put a plug in for diversity, equity, and inclusion as a shared responsibility. Because oftentimes when there is an office created and a person in that role, while that may be good, it is not sufficient. And you cannot say, okay, now I'm going to put it in that box over there, and that's where that happens. It has to be a shared responsibility throughout the entire community.
Thank you.
Agreed. I would just say the +1, I would definitely agree. The choices that I think the choices that societies make in their budget line items really tells a story about what they value. So if your society doesn't have line items that really suggest that you support initiatives for DEI, then you need to question what your shared values are, because that's what it's telling us. Your budget tells us what you think is valuable.
Another challenge that both of you hit upon in your remarks related to ethics and codes of conduct. And the Entomological Society of America passed a relatively expansive code of conduct ethics policy, I believe last year, which governed in conference activities and also activities outside of ESA activities. Dr. Barabino, can you talk a little bit about your code of ethics?
Sure. Some of the policies that I mentioned earlier that relate to sexual harassment, we extend those types of policies for the behavior that's expected in the society overall. And I think it's also important to, if you're going to have some consequences, that you follow those consequences, that the consequences that you lay out in your policies, that you actually adhere to them. because it is the comment that if you don't, then what's the point of the policy? No one will feel like they have to stay true to that. I do think that the size of AAAS and the length of its history has afforded it the opportunity to really engage in policies over time and embed them in ways that they're really having some impact. But what's interesting right now, even with that long history, we were just going through a modernization process. And through that modernization process, you have those tough discussions about what stays in and what stays out. And I do believe that the code of ethics that we have in now is the kind that will really help us move forward.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question that was presented by an audience member. Universities are the training grounds for many of our disciplines. Are there suggestions for what we can do to integrate DEI into our curricula at all levels and get university leadership to lead these efforts?
I would say that's a tough one. I mean, that's, I think everybody's goal is to have chancellors, have deans, have department chairs, have undergraduate curriculum coordinators and graduate program coordinators, all kind of invested in the same long-term goal to diversify the curriculum. But like for the discussions we've had for scientific societies, without steady, persistent work, it just won't happen. Because if it was going to happen innately, then it would already have happened. So I think that it really matters if you who's on the hiring committee, who makes the decisions for the people that go into these roles. And I think that it's really important to be invested. Some of us don't want to get really bogged down with administrative tasks, or we don't really necessarily want to volunteer for extra committees, but it's really important to be in a decision-making position so that the people who do go into these kind of top positions in our institutions, we have people in those jobs that really have this kind of as one of their main targets and one of their main goals. Without someone that's willing to kind of put pressure and enforce, as Dr. Barabino mentioned, kind of, if there's no consequences, if you say you need to diversify and there's no consequences if you don't diversify the curriculum, then it's just not going to happen. So you really need to have there be some type of consequences. And sometimes that's the only thing something that really only a department chair or dean or even a chancellor could really enforce. And so you really need to have people in those positions, in those roles, who for them, that is one of their primary goals and missions. I have served on a couple of those hiring committees before, and it is long. They're like kind of separate and different from just hiring a faculty colleague, because you're often cloistered somewhere and away from the other faculty. We did ours in a hotel, I think, and it was a lot of long hours and long days. But I think that is such important work if you have the opportunity to participate in that, so that you can ensure that the people that are being selected who have vision to really keep that in mind, that diversifying our curriculum is the long-term goal.
I want to add to what Dr. Ware was saying, because it's really important that those who are in the institutions reflect society. And so if you have more faculty of color, for example, you are more likely to draw in more students of color. And the same thing for people from LGBTQ plus, whatever it is, if you have more of that present in your organization, you're more likely to attract. But then what happens is people think it's just a numbers game, it's just representational. So if I get my numbers up, I'm done. No, you're not done, because it's not just a matter of increasing numbers. It's how you engage and involve people in your community and create an inclusive community. Leaders do play an important role in that. Dr. Ware is completely correct about that. But I also want to say one other thing that I think is really important in drawing and retaining those from historically excluded groups and women as well. Relevance. If we can make our fields, our professional societies, our organizations, our institutions relevant to those who have been marginalized, they're much more likely to enter, stay, and be successful. So I will share an example of work at Olin. We tend to be team-based, project-oriented. We involve the users that we are designing for in the design. And at the school's inception, it's relatively new. It was established in 1997. But part of the founding precepts was to have gender parity. And that kind of intentionality in how the institution was formed and how the student body was populated actually said something about the environment and said something about how those people in the teams operated. So that combination is not just representational diversity, it's interactional diversity and the quality of that, and having leaders and people who reflect society and the institutions will really create some change.
Thank you, Doctors Ware and Barabino. So there is another question from the audience that I would like to read. As an immigrant scientist, I am surprised how little conversation is focused on welcoming immigrants into science. Universities do a reasonable job, but the number of associations that start with American is staggering. Even the word American, as we all know, has challenges. Is there a way to address that?
I think that this is a very important question. I thank you for posing it. It's one that we've talked a lot about at the Entomological Society of America, the name of which is a long, we've had that name for a long time. And so people sometimes feel very passionately about keeping the America, but we are an international organization, just as we're an international organization. Entomology itself is global. There's insects all over the whole world, 1.5 million species everywhere. The impacts of entomology is really far reaching in every country, in every biome. Why do we have this name? I think that there have been, and I'm not sure if you find this for the AAAS as well, Dr. Barabino, but we have had at times, intentional campaigns and pushes to try and increase international membership, and invariably, what ends up happening is we still have a very North American focus in terms of the timing of when we hold our meetings. So if we do have international participants who are in different time zones, they're having to attend things in the middle of the night. The languages that we have a lot of our text in is primarily in English. And so we're saying one thing, but we're actually sending a different message with the actions that we have. And I don't just mean, like for all societies, I think this is something that we really, as you mentioned, need to do a much better job at. And this is something that I think should be really part of, as you mentioned, question asker. This should be something that should be part of all of the DEIC work. All of the diversity, equity, and inclusion committees should be focusing on this as well.
The only thing I'd add, I think that was a great response, is that often we do have to look beyond the name to what's actually happening. What are the actual actions? And so AAAS, for example, has always been global and a worldly, international level professional society and interdisciplinary. But I don't think it's wrong to question how we name things. And because I think as a society, we are revisiting a lot of words that we use. Even if you think about how we refer to people from marginalized groups, there's something about paying attention to the words that we use and what they stand for. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but also take a look at the actions, particularly when there's some history that you can actually judge someone over the course of their history.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. How can institutions of higher education and societies work together across the STEM ecosystem to advance DEI, where they share many aspects of their communities? And I'm going to add to the question a little, because one of my thoughts oftentimes is societies are at the absolute end of the pipeline. Students have gone through high school, college, graduate school, and they're working. And so if graduate schools and colleges of higher ed are not diverse, societies will have challenges becoming diverse. So how do we as societies work with or provide carrots and incentives to schools to actually become more representative outside of the awards process?
Well, I think one thing to think about is that the professional society has a role in socializing people into the profession, and it's professionalization. If the professional society, and that's their role, if you don't wait to really engage folks, and I mean really engage them until they become professionals. So if the professional societies are having meaningful opportunities for engagement for young people at earlier and earlier stages. So maybe in some societies, graduate students are presenting. Well, what about undergraduate students presenting? What about even pre-college? You know, what are the things that are being done by the professional society in a meaningful way? And maybe partnering with the institutions as you are developing and socializing people towards your profession, especially in ways that you retain them and don't lose them along the way.
I think those are all great points. And I would only add just that for a lot of people, their academic department actually isn't where their community is. For many of us, our academic department might be a general biology department, for example, with no other entomologists. And so your only kind of avenue for collaboration, for grant partnerships, for